was a hunter in the woods who, after a long day of hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making an effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned to face the wall, and exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned, blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. Everyone was hungry. At that time, people were telling the tale of a young woman who saw a blind man picking his way through a crowd. The two started to talk. The man asked her for a favor. Could she deliver the letter to the address on the envelope? And, well, it was on her way home, so she agreed. She started out to deliver the message. When she turned around to see if there was anything else the blind man needed, she spotted him hurrying through the crowd without his smoked glasses or white cane. She went to the police, who rated the address on the envelope, where they found heaps of human flesh for sale. And what was in the envelope? This is the last one I am sending you today. Try this. Turn off the music, turn off the TV, if you have to, turn off the computer. Then go into another room and sit in total silence. Do you hear that? That ringing? People say it's your brain making up a sound to explain the silence, but people lied. I can't tell you what is making that sound, but whatever it is, you don't want to meet it. It is trying to break through, force its way into our plane of existence. Now try this. Repeat the first steps. Turn everything off, except this time, turn the lights off too. Still hear that ringing? Better hope you do, because if you don't, it means they finally managed to break through, and no amount of running will save you. You're the manager of a small store. You hired one of your friends and you just found out that he's been stealing from the register, stealing stock, abandoning his post to visit with his girlfriend in the back room while he's the only one on duty, and the argument you had with him at the office just didn't settle it for you. You pound on his door. When he opens up, he goes pale, soils himself, and staggers back, gasping for a breath. It doesn't impress you, really. You figure he just thinks you're showing up with cops, until you step through his door and glance to the side, where you get a good look at yourself in the mirror, or at least the parts of you that are still recognizable after that gunshot blast that your friend gave you at the end of that argument. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short-side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped, dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I'd put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and the sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoe steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the f... Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off of the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. Peter Pan is not what most people think he is, or I guess I should say would be, but honestly, he is real. I've not only seen him, but have also felt him. I met Peter Pan when I was about 11 years old. It had been a hard day with my family. I was playing outside with my siblings. They were both older than me. Sue was my 15-year-old sister, and James was my 14-year-old brother. Of course, like most siblings their age, they didn't want to be around me. They had dates and homework, and James had drugs and other stupid shit like that, too. But they were forced to entertain me. I don't specifically
remember what we were doing, but I do remember noticing an animal on the road. My siblings noticed me looking at it, and James told me to go see what it was. My brother always made me nervous, so I walked up to it and realized it was a dead cat. From my view, I could see that the cat was missing at least one eye, where a nest of maggots was beginning to form, and I could see various bald spots and scratches that seeped blood. It was also missing a leg and half of its tail. James told me to touch it. My sister argued that it was disgusting and could be infected. James smacked her hard. Naturally, she cried out in pain, and he shouted at her, "Stay the hell out of it!" Then he got right in my face and told me quietly he wanted me to pick it up. I was hesitant, but after watching what he did to Sue, I had no choice. I reached around it and found that it still had an eye in the other socket, but it was also missing half of its chest and had all kinds of gross, traumatic stuff inside of it from days of lying in the street. Next was even worse, and I wish I would have risked my brother hurting me, cause he told me to put it on our neighbor's lawn. She was an old widow. Although I don't remember her name, she is long dead by now. James told me to put the cat on the porch, ring the doorbell, and run away as fast as I could. So I did. I set the cat down on the porch and wiped my bloody hands on my jeans. I looked at the doorbell. I probably wouldn't have done it if my brother hadn't shouted, "Hurry up, idiot!" Terrified of him, I rang the doorbell and dashed behind another neighbor's bush. The widow opened the door and shrieked at the disgusting sight of the cat. And I looked for my siblings, who had both apparently ran off. Obviously, my hiding spot was not very hidden, and I was easily spotted. She started shouting at me, and I ran home. That night, I was scolded by both my parents, while my other siblings were let off with a warning. James blamed me, saying I doorbell ditched with the dead cat even after he said to stay away from it. And because of the red mark on Sue's cheek, he even said that I slapped my sister when she tried to intervene. My sister, out of fear of my brother, agreed. All of my attempts to defend myself were deflected, and I was sent to my bed early. I sat there waiting to get called down for dinner until I heard the table being set, and waited to be called down to eat, but never was. I sat in anger and solace until midnight. That's when he showed up. Of course, my room was very dark, but because my family was so poor, I had holes in my curtains, and light always peeked through. I could see shadows coming through, dissipating what light was left. That's when I saw a hand slowly open the curtain, and a boy, about my age, jumped through. It was Peter Pan. Peter was not exactly what I expected. I could barely make out what he looked like in the dark, and the moonlight behind him wasn't much help. Even though I couldn't see him, I could tell he was looking at me. I could feel it. He asked, "It's been a hard day, hasn't it?" "Who are you?" I replied. I did not feel afraid. Rather, I felt comforted by this stranger's voice. "My name is Peter Pan," he answered. "And what if I told you that you could go someplace where you would never have to worry about any of that sort of thing again?" I couldn't help it. I wanted to say yes, even though I knew I shouldn't. I said, "You want me to go to Neverland?" Peter finished. Despite what had happened that day, I was still reluctant to leave. Despite the fact that my sister didn't do much to help me, I knew that deep down she wanted to. She was just as helpless as I was in the situation. As if reading my thoughts, Peter added, "Don't worry about your sister. We'll bring her in soon. But first, we have to prepare." After that, there was nothing to consider. Peter Pan stretched out his hand so that I could take it and said, "The reason birds can fly and we can't is simply because they have perfect faith. To have faith is to have wings." And just like that, I flew. Flying was amazing, like a dream you never want to wake up from. We went higher and higher until we were just below the clouds and we could see the light coming from the buildings. It was beautiful. The best part of this was that I wasn't afraid of falling, not even for a moment. Considering I was hundreds of feet in the air, far too high for anyone to see, especially in the dark, you might imagine that I would have been terrified, but I wasn't. Instead, I was overjoyed, bursting with a fierce excitement. It was pure joy. After flying around the buildings, we took our leave and headed over the ocean. which took several minutes to traverse. The farther we got from land, the darker the water became. I assumed it was part of the lights, until I saw Neverland, which appeared as an abyss in the sea, even darker than the sky. There were no stars at all, and no clouds. Everything was pitch black. This is the first time I became nervous since I had met Peter Pan. When we landed, the island seemed a little higher, but not by much. Then I realized something. I hadn't seen Tinkerbell at all, so I asked, "Hey Peter Pan, where's Tinkerbell?" Peter Pan looked at me, and although it was too dark to see his face, I could tell he was smiling, and it was very sinister. Now I was no longer nervous. I was afraid. After staring for several seconds, he turned around and walked into what appeared to be a cave. There was no light in the cave, and the passage was lengthy. Every time we stopped, I could feel breathing on my neck. But after a couple of hours, I saw light. We walked into a room, and the light from the fire in the middle was blinding and hot. "Sit down," Peter commanded, "and give yourself some time for your eyes to adjust to the light." In no mood to argue, I did as I was told, and even before my eyes had a chance to adjust, Peter turned to ask me, "Do you believe in fairies? If you do, clap your hands." I again did as I was told, and instantaneously my vision was returned to me. In the newfound light, and to my utter shock and dismay, I beheld handiwork of a monster, a horror behind my wildest imagination. A pile of corpses, many of which belonged to people who appeared to be just a few years older than me, lay before me, all of them horribly mutilated. I turned around to see that more than teenagers had been harmed. I saw cages filled with fairies. Some were dead, but most were alive and in pain. Some were missing limbs, legs, or arms. In some cases, even their wings had been torn off. Others had been impaled with sewing needles repeatedly. Once again, I turned around to see Peter Pan, and it was like I was truly seeing him for the first time, as he truly looked. Peter was the worst sight of all. His skin was paper pale, his eyes were completely black, except for pupils, which were red. He was bleeding from both his eyes and his gaping mouth, and he was smiling. Sincerely smiling. His hair was caked with a mixture of both fresh and dry blood. His clothes were a dark green type of cloth and were stitched together by human hair. Instead of sleeves, he had leaves over his shoulders, and his pants, which were hemmed just below the knees, were in tatters. To top it all off, he wore cloth shoes. In terror, I ran, but as soon as I realized there was no way out, not even the entrance through which I had arrived was accessible. And all the while, Peter was just standing there, smiling, and said to me, "I know I've made a mess, but you see, they grow up so fast. This way they'll stay young forever, just like me, and they will always be in Neverland." I sat there with my head tucked between my legs. Peter Pan grabbed me by my hair, lifted me up, and said, "I have a gift for you. I know you were worried about leaving your sister behind, so I brought her here with us." Then, with his fist still wound around a fistful of my hair, he forced me to look at a sad figure chained up on one side of the room. It was my sister, Sue. She looked awful. Peter continued, "You see, she's just a little too old to be in Neverland, but you needn't be sorry for her. She was the type who enjoys growing up, and in the end, she aged of her own free will." Then Peter Pan chained me across from her so that I could watch as he worked on her. Before long, we were both in agony, sobbing uncontrollably. Peter grabbed Sue by the hair and tore out a handful. She screamed in angst. He tossed the hair to the ground in front of me, put his hand on either side of Sue's head, and shushed her. Then he dug his thumbs into her eyes as she shrieked. In moments she was blind and blood was pouring out of her sockets. "I can't have you sitting down," Peter chided her. "You need to feel the excitement with me." He drew a knife and stabbed her in the shoulder and twisted the blade. He then pulled the hook from the dark ceiling, sticking it through the flesh wound. Then he slowly cut her stomach with a knife, deep enough to ensure that she would bleed out. Then he worked his way up so he could watch himself cut her without blood getting in the way. He worked all the way up to her chest, at which point he stopped and said, "Sue, you don't have to cry. I bet I have the solution to your tears." Then he cut her tongue out and tossed it to my lap. I was choking back sobs by then. Next, he dug the knife between each of Sue's fingernails. The first one came off clean, and the second one was just as swift. When it came to the third one, he slowly inserted the blade and twisted it. Finally, he took the knife and stabbed Sue in the stomach, giving the blade one final twist. Sue moaned one last time before succumbing to her injuries. Then Peter turned around and said, "Don't worry, you'll never grow up." But he didn't kill me. I'm still here, and I watch Peter Pan do the same thing that he did to my sister, to other kids, every night. I used to try and warn them, but he taught me that it's wrong to question him. Peter Pan taught me a lot of things. I still have at least a few years until he kills me. If I'm lucky, I'll persuade him to do it sooner. I love you, Sue, and I'm so sorry. The sleeping mind fascinates me, namely the nighttime hallucinations we call dreams. But of this, I keep a journal to record every thought that passes through my brain at night. I set at least one alarm each day so that I'm able to wake up during my REM cycles and recall my grandest dreams. Sometimes I fall back asleep, but for the most part, I keep up with it. It's been an enlightening experience, and so far, I filled a dozen notebooks with my nightly adventures. In addition to cataloging my dreams, I study the phenomenon. I've dissected every sleep guide at my disposal and watched countless documentaries. I even took an elective back in high school called Nocturnal Fantasies. Though it only lasted one semester, not enough students shared my affinity for the topic. In other words, most of my waking life is consumed by sleep, in one form or another. Craving more knowledge on the subject, I recently pursued my town library's massive local authors section. I was hoping to find a book on dreams I hadn't read, as this was the one part of the library I had yet to set foot in. It was a long shot, but one I was willing to take in the name of research. After fishing through a bunch of romance novels, I happened to come across one nonfiction title that caught my eye. Sleep Tactics, Exercises for a Mind at Rest, written by Jack Grovewood. The blurb on the back was quotes like, "Learn the secrets to a good night's rest," and "Feed your mind's insatiable appetite for a better understanding." Not a book on dreams per se, but it did pique my interest. Delving into the book at home, I found it to be more up my alley than I previously expected. It was filled with chapters pertaining to lucid dreaming, meditation, and even sleepwalking. I was already familiar with most of the content, but it turned out to be an enjoyable read. It wasn't until the last chapter, though, I was caught completely off guard. I will outline most of it below. Chapter 16, How to Exit Your Body. Disclaimer, this is not an OEB or out and of body experience. As stated in Chapter 8, out of body, out of bed, I do believe in OBEs, but I find that they're just another form of dreaming. What I'm about to explain to you is something completely different. It's neither an OBE or any other dream state. This is a way to truly exit your body using sleep paralysis as a catalyst. Before I discuss the specifics, I'd like to go over a few prerequisites. To pull this off, you must be proficient at lucid dreaming. What I mean by that is that you need to have lucid dreams regularly and retain lucidity for long periods of time in these dreams. It also helps if you're able to manipulate your dream environment with ease. If you only lucid dream on occasion, you'll have to train your mind to do so more often. For more on that, see Chapter 6, Becoming a Lucid Lucy. If you, however, are unable to lucid dream, then this technique is not for you. It's nothing personal. You simply lack the tools needed for departure. Another requirement is sleep paralysis. Most of us have experienced this one time or another, but it will help immensely if you experience it on a regular basis. Coupled with lucidity and a focused mind, sleep paralysis is the only way out of your own skin, so to speak. That's all you need in the way of mental capabilities, more or less. It's an added bonus if you've had an OBE or awake-initiated lucid dream. Now, on to the fun part. I'm going to lay this out in a step-by-step fashion, followed by a more detailed explanation of what to expect upon achieving your first departure. Keep in mind that results may vary. Step 1. Fall asleep on your back in a slanted position. It could be on a recliner or a car seat, but your body must be diagonal relative to ground level. That's the only way I've ever been able to get this to work. For one reason or another, gravity always plays a role. Step 2. Attain sleep paralysis. This is more of a waiting game than a step, as it's not entirely possible to execute at will. When it does happen, lucidity is key. You must be aware that you're in a state of sleep paralysis and be unafraid of your lack of mobility. This is one of the ways being a lucid dreamer comes in handy. Step 3. Once paralyzed, attempt to move your legs. If you're in the proper position, at least one of them should be mobile. If you can't move either leg, then you'll have to restart an experience by tilting your seat in a different position. Step 4. Upon freeing one or more of your legs, attempt to free your arms. They will feel incredibly stiff, but you shouldn't be able to move them. Try as you might. You should then feel a sharp sting in your head. Don't be alarmed. You're not having an aneurysm. This is completely normal and is necessary to make your exit. Step 5. As difficult and strenuous as it may be, try to free your arms. As you do this, attempt to move the rest of your body as well. Put everything you have into fighting the paralysis. Just don't fall back asleep. Step 6. As you wrestle with your mind and body, the stinging sensation in your brain is going to grow. It won't be painful, but it will cause you great discomfort. Let it happen. As the sensation builds, you'll start to feel yourself drift away from your body. Don't fight it. Your mind is like a rubber band and it will want to bounce back from where it's being stretched. Don't let it. Follow the flow of departure. If you steal your mind's focus and follow these instructions to a T, you will have successfully exit your earthly meat sack and unlock the marvel of the mind that has only just begun to be understood. And that's the gist of it. The author went on to say that the world you find yourself in upon departure will harbor some differences to the one you started in. It will appear similar in almost every way, but will be completely void of any life forms. On top of that, nothing will budge. Everything will remain in its place, as still as can be. After revealing the delicate process of re-entering one's body, the author ended the chapter with an eerie warning. Whatever you do, do not go near the water. I was dumbfounded. The entire book up to that point was factual, but the last chapter seemed like something out of a science fiction novel. It certainly made for a good environment, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Why have such an out-of-place pseudo-science chapter in an otherwise reputable book? It just didn't make any sense. About a week passed before I thought about the book again. It was almost time to return it to the library, so I decided to reread its final chapter. As absurd as it seemed, I teetered between laughing it off once and for all, and actually giving it a shot. I did meet all of the requirements, and it would amuse me to some small extent. I could, at the very least, say that I tried it for myself, if for no other reason than to prove it was a load of crap. After weighing the pros and cons, I ended up giving in to my curiosity. I knew it wasn't gonna work, but it would be a fun little experiment, if nothing else. Besides, was there really anything better for me to do during an episode of sleep paralysis? The only minor nausea was that I'd have to sleep on one of my recliners instead of my comfort king-size bed. A small price to pay, for the sake of scientific discovery, I suppose. On the night in question, I wound up having 3 episodes of sleep paralysis. During the first, I was far too groggy. I completely forgot about the book and quickly fell back asleep. The second one lasted a bit longer, and I was able to remember the steps outlined in the last chapter. I could just barely move one of my legs, and upon trying my arms, I did feel small but noticeable discomfort in my head. I wondered for a split second if the author was onto something, and that made me a bit excited. Because of this, I jolted awake. Reflecting on that incident, I became intrigued. I still didn't believe that I could exit my body, but I knew something was going on. I decided to tilt the recliner back a bit and try again. This time I would have better control. Next episode came pretty quick. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, but my body was getting ready to. This is it, I thought. I allowed the sleep paralysis to fully set in before attempting anything, It was difficult not to fall asleep, but I managed. This time around, I was able to gain full control over my left leg. I moved it back and forth a few times before trying to free my arms. True to the method, they wouldn't budge and felt oddly stiff, more so than usual. This is when the familiar sting set in. It jarred me, but I kept going. The more I tried to move my arms, the greater the sting grew. Believe it or not, as I continued, I did in fact feel myself drifting away from my body. I tried to keep it up, but my nerves got the best of me. I lost all control just for a moment and was sucked right back into my body, immediately waking up in the process. This experience startled the hell out of me. It was beginning to seem more and more likely that the last chapter of Jack Rovert's book was somehow accurate. My curiosity became aroused to such an extent that I felt the overwhelming need to tell somebody about it. Luckily, I knew just the person. My buddy Josh is quite the character. He believes in a lot of what I don't. This causes us to butt heads on a lot of topics. In simple terms, I'm a skeptic and he's a believer. One thing we can agree on, however, is our love for dreams. He's the only person I could talk to at length about the subject. He also happens to meet the requirements listed in the book. I was hoping he would join me for a sleep session and help me get to the bottom of what was going on. I called up Josh and told him everything. He was ecstatic, as I knew he would be, and agreed to meet me at my place the following night for a departure. In his mind, this was going to go off without a hitch. I wasn't completely sold onto it yet. I was just happy to have someone else to tag along for the ride. Fast forward to the following night. We hung out for a bit, and I showed Josh the book. His eyes grew wide upon reading the final chapter, and he couldn't wait to try it out himself. I told him not to get his hopes up, but it was clear to me that they already were. Ready as ever, we laid down at opposite ends of the living room on my two recliners. Josh cracked a joke about how it was the first night we'd be sleeping together. I threw my pillow at him, and then we were off. Shut-eye was just around the corner. This is when things took a turn for the bizarre. I didn't have an episode of sleep paralysis right away, but I did end up waking a few hours into my nap. I noticed that Josh was fast asleep in the recliner across the room. Needing to empty my bladder, I walked past him to get to the bathroom, tripping over his legs in the process. I met the floor with a thud and turned around to see if Josh had awakened. To my surprise, he hadn't. I knew he was a heavy sleeper, but even he should have woken up, given the commotion. Becoming worried, I called out his name. No reaction. I tried shaking him. Nothing. I grabbed the wrist and checked his pulse. It was there, however, weak. This was when I panicked. I ran to my room, grabbed my phone, and scrambled to hit the call button. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard a loud gasp from the next room, like a diver coming up for air. I ran out there as fast as I could, and to my delight, Josh was awake. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, "Dude, it freaking worked." I was blown away. Though Josh was an overenthusiastic believer and downright stubborn at times, he was no liar. I asked him more than once if he was sure it wasn't just a dream, and he insisted that he was absolutely certain. Between his firm conviction and the weak pulse just moments before, I had no choice but to believe him. It seemed that the book was legitimate after all. We spent the next couple of hours talking about it. After leaving his body, Josh found himself in the living room, but it was noticeably inanimate. Everything was perfectly still, not even a speck of dust floating through the air. Josh also noticed that his body was translucent, a milky white outline of its former shape. He attempted to open the door to my house, but the knob wouldn't turn, and the door would not budge. It took a while for him to realize this, but he found that his new form allowed him to phase through walls. Josh went on to tell me that world's outside was very different from ours. He said it was like having the contrast dialed up on a picture. That and the static nature of everything made it feel like it was being trapped in a photograph. I tried to imagine it, but I knew I needed to see it for myself. We made plans to go back to sleep and enter the world together. Despite my excitement, I was able to make my first successful departure that night. Josh was waiting in the room for me, next to his sleeping body. Seeing ourselves like that was fascinating in itself. But I wanted more than anything to see the world outside, a world where adventure and discovery awaited us. For a few weeks, Josh slept over at my house and we explored the new world. It was fun and downright addicting. Curiosity was what kept us going, and we wanted to know more and more about the odd realm we had discovered. Here are just a few things we learned during our exertions. The lighting is fixed. It always looks to be about noontime, so there's no sun in the sky. It's impossible to phase through older buildings. Not sure why. There are no life forms, just as the book stated, not even animals or insects. Sound is reverbed. There's always a slight echo when Josh and I talk. It's possible to fall asleep there, but you won't dream. If you travel too far from your body, you'll hit an invisible wall and be unable to go any further. And time doesn't pass in the real world while you're departed. After about a month of successful departures, things changed. The more we explored, the more uncomfortable I felt. It always seemed like something was watching us, even though there was no one around. Josh was the opposite. Our late night adventures were becoming so routine for him that he was becoming bored. He kept talking about the water, and he wanted to get a closer look at the pond near the main road. I reminded Josh of the author's warning, but it didn't seem to faze him. Eventually, his curiosity got the best of him. One night, upon leaving my body, Josh was nowhere to be found. I thought that maybe he hadn't departed yet, but up to that point, he had always beaten me to the punch. This could only mean one thing. I raced through the walls of my home and raced to the nearby pond. Josh was there, standing at the end of the dock that locals use for fishing in the real world. I yelled out at him, "Josh, what are you doing?" "It's fine. See, there's nothing to be afraid of. It's just water." I watched as Josh reached down and touched the surface of the pond. It rippled. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The water should not have reacted. We'd been there for weeks and hadn't seen a single thing move. Even the air was still. Perplexed, I began walking out towards Josh. He lifted his hand up, just as awestruck as I was. As he pulled his arm back, the ripple expanded. With it, a small portion of the water turned black. After a few moments, something reached out of the blackness. It was a hand. A freaking hand. It reached up and grabbed Josh's legs, yanking him downward. He went feet first into the water, holding onto the dock for his dear life. As he screamed, I ran toward him, but before I could get halfway to his position, I watched him disappear into the water. I ran the rest of the way, but the darkness had faded and returned to normal. My best friend was gone. In a state of fear-induced panic, I ran away. I wanted to save Josh, but I didn't know how. Plus, I felt that if I re-entered my body, perhaps I'd find him awake in the real world. It was wishful thinking, but it was all I had. That wishful thinking fell flat when I awoke. Josh was still unconscious. I tried and tried, but I could not wake him. Eventually, I called 911 and he was taken away on a stretcher. The doctors say he's in a coma, but can't discern what caused it. And that's everything. I'm a wreck over what happened. I've tried visiting Josh in the hospital, but I can't face his parents, and they're always there. Instead, I go out to the pond in the real world, hoping that somehow I'll find answers. All I do end up finding are more questions. They keep me up at night, along with a recurring nightmare, replaying events from that day. I've tried departing since, but to no avail. Something's holding me back. It might be fear. That world is like a photograph, a still frame of a place we were never meant to see. A moment frozen in time with a layer of reality stripped away, and something is living there. Despite this truth, I feel a need to dive back in and save my friend. He didn't heed the author's warning, but I'm the reason he entered that world in the first place. I'm the reason he can't wake up, and I have to go back and save him.